The drifter's unexpected family. A gunslinger with no name stumbles upon a burned-down homestead and a little girl praying over her parents' graves. Now he has a reason to stay. The sun hung low over the Montana plains, casting long shadows across a landscape scarred by fire and neglect. The homestead was little more than a husk, charred beams jutting from the earth like broken bones, the air thick with the acrid scent of ash. The drifter, known only as Jack, reined in his horse, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the ruin. His coat was dusty, his hat worn low to shield a face hardened by years of wandering. The revolver at his hip was a constant weight, a reminder of the life he'd chosen, or the one that had chosen him. He'd seen burned homesteads before, victims of bandits or bad luck, but something about this one stopped him. It wasn't the silence, though that was heavy enough, nor the faint curl of smoke still rising from the wreckage. It was the small figure kneeling in the dirt, her hands clasped over two fresh graves, her voice a trembling whisper carried on the wind. "Please, Lord, don't let them be alone up there," she prayed, her words raw with grief. She was no more than 10, her dress torn, her face streaked with soot and tears. Jack dismounted, his boots crunching on the scorched earth. The girl didn't look up, didn't seem to notice him at all. Her hair, a tangle of auburn, fell across her face as she bent lower, her fingers tracing the crude crosses staked into the ground. Jack's chest tightened, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. He'd buried his own family once, his wife, his infant son, taken by fever in a town that no longer existed on any map. He'd walked away from that life, from the pain, vowing never to care again. Yet here he was, rooted to the spot, watching a child pray over graves that shouldn't have been hers to dig. He stepped closer, his shadow falling across her, and she flinched, her head snapping up. Her eyes, green and wide, held a mix of fear and defiance. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking but sharp. She scrambled to her feet, clutching a small knife, its blade dull but held with intent. Jack raised his hands, palms open, his voice low and steady. "Just passing through," he said. "Saw the smoke. Thought someone might need help." He kept his eyes on hers, avoiding the knife, giving her the space to decide if he was a threat. She was thin, her cheeks hollow, and the way she stood braced, ready to run, told him she'd been alone too long. "Ma and Pa don't need help no more," she said, her voice breaking. "They're gone." She gestured to the graves, and Jack's gaze followed, taking in the fresh-turned earth, the crosses made from broken fence posts. He didn't ask what happened. The charred remains of the homestead told enough of the story. Raiders, likely, or a fire that got out of hand. Either way, the girl was alone now, and the world wasn't kind to orphans. "You got a name?" he asked, keeping his tone gentle, like he was coaxing a skittish colt. "Emma," she said after a long pause, her grip on the knife loosening, but not letting go. "Emma Tate." "Jack," he offered, though it wasn't his real name. He hadn't spoken that in years, not since he'd left his old life behind. "You been out here long, Emma?" She shrugged, her eyes darting to the horizon. "Since yesterday, or maybe the day before." Her voice was small, but there was a strength in it, a stubbornness that reminded Jack of himself at her age, before the world had worn him down. He glanced around, noting the absence of food, water, or shelter. The nearest town, Willow Creek, was a day's ride, and the plains were no place for a child alone. He should have walked away, kept riding, let someone else deal with her. But the memory of his son's tiny grave kept him there, his boots rooted to the ground. "You can't stay here," he said, more to himself than to her. "Not like this." Emma's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing. "I ain't leaving them," she said, nodding toward the graves. "They're my family." Jack's throat ached, but he kept his face neutral. "They'd want you safe," he said. "There's a town not far. I can take you there, find someone to look after you." Her eyes narrowed, searching his face for lies. "You gonna sell me off? Like the man who came through last week, talking about taking me to work in some saloon?" Jack's blood ran cold, his hand twitching toward his revolver before he caught himself. "No," he said, his voice hard with conviction. "I don't do that. I'll get you to town, and you'll be safe. That's all." Emma studied him, her knife still in hand, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. She was exhausted. He could see it. Her eyes heavy, her small frame swaying in the wind. "I ain't got nowhere else to go," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Jack nodded, his decision made before he could think better of it. "Then you come with me," he said. "Just for now. We'll figure the rest later." He expected her to argue, but she only nodded, her eyes returning to the graves. She knelt again, whispering something Jack couldn't hear, then stood and tucked the knife into her pocket. He led her to his horse, a sturdy bay named Rusty, and lifted her onto the saddle. She was light, too light, and he felt a pang of anger at the world that had left her like this. As they rode toward Willow Creek, the sun dipping below the horizon, Jack kept his eyes on the trail, but his thoughts were on Emma. She sat stiffly in front of him, her hands clutching the saddle horn, her silence louder than any words. He didn't know what he was doing, didn't know how to care for a child, didn't know if he could keep her safe, but he knew he couldn't leave her behind. The plain stretched out, vast and unforgiving, but for the first time in years, Jack felt a purpose beyond survival. He didn't see the man watching from a distant ridge, his horse half hidden in the dusk, his eyes fixed on the girl and the drifter who'd claimed her. The Montana dusk settled over the plains, a cold purple veil that swallowed the last traces of daylight. Jack rode steadily, his horse Rusty's hooves kicking up dust as they moved toward Willow Creek. Emma sat in front of him, her small frame rigid against the saddle, her hands still gripping the horn as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the world. She hadn't spoken since they left the burned homestead, and Jack didn't press her. He knew grief, knew the way it could choke words before they formed. His own memories of a wife's fevered brow, a son's still body, pressed against him, but he pushed them down, focusing on the trail ahead. The wind carried the scent of sage and frost, and Jack's eyes scanned the horizon, wary of shadows. He'd seen the signs at the homestead, hoof prints circling the wreckage. Too many for a simple accident. Raiders, likely, or worse. The thought of Emma alone out there, with men like that prowling, made his jaw tighten. He adjusted his grip on the reins, careful not to jostle the girl, and glanced at her. Her face was pale, her auburn hair tangled against her neck, but her eyes were dry now, fixed on the distance with a determination that belied her age. "You warm enough?" he asked, his voice low, cutting through the silence. He draped his spare coat over her, the wool swallowing her small shoulders, but the night was turning bitter. Emma nodded, barely, her lips pressed tight. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was thin, strained. She didn't look at him, and Jack didn't push. He'd seen that look before, in men who'd lost everything, soldiers, drifters, himself. She was holding herself together, and he wouldn't take that from her. The trail dipped into a shallow valley, and Jack spotted a cluster of cottonwoods near a creek, their branches stark against the sky. "We'll stop there," he said, nodding toward the trees. "Rest for the night. Willow Creek's still a ways off." Emma's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't argue. Jack guided Rusty to the creek, dismounting and lifting Emma down with a gentleness that felt foreign to his calloused hands. She stood close to the horse, her hand resting on its flank, as if drawing strength from its warmth. Jack tethered Rusty, then set about gathering wood, his movements swift but deliberate. He built a small fire, its flames casting a flickering glow across the clearing, and pulled a tin of beans and a chunk of hardtack from his saddlebag. "Eat," he said, handing Emma a spoon and a share of the food. "It ain't much, but it'll keep you going." He sat across from her, the fire between them, and ate slowly, giving her space. She took the spoon, her movements hesitant and ate in small bites, her eyes darting to him now and then, as if expecting him to change, to become someone she couldn't trust. The fire crackled, and Jack leaned back, his hat tilted low. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said, echoing words he'd heard in his own heart years ago. "But if you want to, I'm here." He kept his gaze on the flames, giving her the freedom to speak or stay silent. Emma's spoon paused, hovering over the tin. "They came at night," she said, her voice so soft it nearly drowned in the wind. Men with guns. Pa told me to hide in the cellar. I heard Ma screaming, then the fire. She stopped, her fingers tightening around the spoon. When I came out, they were gone. So were Ma and Pa. Jack's chest ached, his hand twitching toward the revolver at his hip. He forced it still, his voice steady. You did what you could, Emma. You stayed alive. That's what they'd want. She looked at him then, her green eyes searching his face, looking for a lie. Finding none, she nodded, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction. You ever lose someone? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack's throat tightened, the memory of his son's tiny hand flashing unbidden. Yeah, he said, his voice rough. I have. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask, but the shared silence felt like a bridge between them, fragile but real. When they finished eating, Jack spread his bedroll near the fire and gestured for Emma to take it. Sleep, he said. I'll keep watch. She hesitated, her eyes flicking to the darkness beyond the firelight, but exhaustion won out. She curled up in the bedroll, the oversized coat draped over her like a blanket, and was asleep in moments, her small chest rising and falling. Jack sat against a tree, his revolver across his lap, his eyes scanning the shadows. The night was quiet, save for the creek's murmur and the occasional hoot of an owl, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He'd learned to trust that instinct, honed by years of dodging bounty hunters and outlaws. Whoever had burned Emma's home might still be out there, and the thought of them finding her made his blood run cold. As dawn broke, painting the sky in streaks of pink, Jack roused Emma gently. Time to move, he said, his voice soft but firm. She rubbed her eyes, her face still pale but less haunted, and climbed onto Rusty without complaint. They rode in silence, the trail winding toward Willow Creek, the town's faint outline appearing as the sun climbed higher. When they reached the edge of town, Jack reined in Rusty, his eyes taking in the dusty streets, the weathered saloon, the small church with its steeple leaning slightly to the left. He glanced at Emma, who was staring at the town with a mix of hope and fear. We'll find someone here, he said, though the words felt hollow. He didn't know if he could leave her, didn't know if he wanted to. Emma's hand tightened on the saddle horn. What if they don't want me? She asked, her voice small. Jack looked at her, his heart twisting. Then you stay with me, he said, the words surprising him as much as her. Until we figure something better. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of trust there, faint but growing. They rode into Willow Creek, the town waking around them, unaware of the man watching from the hills, his rifle glinting in the morning light, his gaze fixed on the girl and the drifter who'd taken her in. The morning sun spilled over Willow Creek, bathing the town in a golden haze that softened its rough edges. Jack led Rusty through the dusty streets, Emma perched in front of him, her small hands clutching the saddle horn. The town was waking slowly, shopkeepers swept porches, a dog barked lazily, and the clatter of a blacksmith's hammer echoed from somewhere down the road. Jack's eyes scanned every face, every alley, his instincts sharpened by years on the run. Emma's silence weighed on him, her small frame tense against his chest, and he wondered what she saw in this place, a refuge or another rejection. They stopped at a boarding house, its sign weathered but welcoming, the scent of fresh bread drifting from an open window. Jack dismounted, lifting Emma down with a care that felt more natural now. Her green eyes flicked to the boarding house, then back to him, wary but curious. Stay close, he said, his voice low, and she nodded, her hand brushing the pocket where her knife hid. Inside, the boarding house was warm, its air thick with the smell of coffee and bacon. The proprietress, a stout woman with gray hair pinned tightly, looked up from a ledger. Morning, she said, her eyes narrowing as she took in Jack's dust-covered coat and Emma's too large one. You looking for a room? For her, Jack said, nodding to Emma. She needs a place to stay, someone to look after her. He didn't mention the burned homestead, didn't mention the graves. The fewer questions, the better. The woman's gaze softened as it landed on Emma, taking in her hollow cheeks and torn dress. Poor thing, she murmured. Orphaned is she? Jack nodded, his jaw tight, and the woman clucked her tongue. I'd take her, but we're full up. You might try the church. Reverend's got a soft spot for strays. Jack thanked her, his hand resting lightly on Emma's shoulder as they stepped back into the street. The church was at the edge of town, its steeple leaning like a tired sentinel. Inside, it was cool and dim, the pews empty save for an old man polishing the altar. The Reverend, a wiry man with kind eyes, listened as Jack explained, briefly, carefully, about Emma. "She's got no one," Jack said, his voice steady. "Needs a home." The Reverend studied Emma, his expression gentle but troubled. "We'd help if we could," he said, "but the orphanage is overfull, and we've no families able to take another mouth. Times are hard." He paused, glancing at Jack. "You seem to care for her. Why not keep her yourself?" Jack's chest tightened, the question hitting harder than he expected. He looked at Emma, who was tracing a finger along a pew, her face unreadable. "I'm not the kind to raise a child," he said, though the words felt like a lie. "I'm just passing through." The Reverend nodded, but his eyes held a knowing look. "Sometimes the Lord puts people in our path for a reason. Think on it." They left the church, Emma quieter than before, her eyes fixed on the ground. Jack led her to a bench outside the general store, sitting beside her as the town bustled around them. "We'll find someone," he said, though doubt gnawed at him. Willow Creek was small, its people stretched thin, and Emma's story wasn't unique enough to stir charity in hard times. Emma looked up at him, her green eyes sharp. "You don't have to keep me," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in it. "I can manage." Jack's throat ached. He saw himself in her, stubborn, proud, carrying a weight too heavy for one so young. "You're not managing alone," he said, his tone firmer than he meant. "Not while I'm here." She studied him, her gaze searching for the truth, and Jack held it, letting her see the resolve he hadn't known he possessed. He stood, offering his hand. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up." He took her to a small cabin at the edge of town, one he'd rented years ago during a brief stay in Willow Creek. It was modest, a single room with a stove, a bed, and a table, but it was clean, the linens fresh, the firewood stacked neatly by the door. Jack set water to heat on the stove, then handed Emma a cloth and a bar of soap. "Wash up," he said. "I'll see about some food." When he returned with a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, and a jar of preserves, Emma was sitting at the table, her face scrubbed clean, her hair damp and combed. The oversized coat was folded neatly beside her, and for the first time, Jack saw the girl she might have been before the fire, bright, curious, strong. He set the food down, slicing the bread with his knife, and they ate in silence, the simple act of sharing a meal grounding them both. As evening fell, Jack lit a lantern, its glow softening the cabin's stark walls. He noticed small things, Emma's careful bites, the way she tucked her hands under the table, the faint smile when she tasted the preserves. He found himself watching her, memorizing her movements, as if she might vanish if he looked away. "You can stay here," he said, breaking the silence. "There's a bed, and I'll take the floor. If you want to leave, the trail's open. But if you stay," he hesitated, the words heavy, "I'll make sure you're safe." Emma's eyes met his, and for a moment, she looked younger, more vulnerable. "Why?" she asked, her voice soft. "You don't know me." Jack leaned back, his hands clasped. "Don't need to know you to see you need someone," he said, "and I've got no one else to look after." She didn't answer, but her shoulders relaxed, and she finished her meal with a quiet determination. When she climbed into the bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin, Jack settled on the floor, his revolver within reach. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackle of the stove, and as Emma's breathing deepened into sleep, Jack felt a shift inside him. He'd spent years running, keeping the world at arm's length, but this girl, this stubborn, grieving child, had cracked something open. He didn't see the shadow move outside the window, didn't hear the faint creak of a boot on the porch. The man from the hills was closer now, his eyes glinting in the dark, watching the cabin where the drifter and the girl had found a fragile peace. The days in Willow Creek passed like the slow turn of a wagon wheel, steady and unhurried, as Jack and Emma settled into the small cabin at the edge of town. The routine was simple but grounding, Jack rose with the dawn to chop wood or mend fences for the townsfolk, while Emma helped with small chores, her hands growing steadier as she swept the floor or scrubbed dishes. The cabin, once a temporary shelter, began to feel like something more, its walls holding the warmth of their shared silences. Yet Jack's eyes never stopped scanning the horizon, his hand resting near his revolver, aware that the piece they'd found was as fragile as a spider's web in a storm. Emma was changing, her grief still raw but softened by the rhythm of their days. She'd taken to sitting on the porch, sketching with the charcoal Jack had bought her, her drawings of horses and birds pinned to the cabin's walls like small claims to a home. Jack watched her from the corner of his eye, noting the way her shoulders no longer hunched with fear, the way her green eyes lit up when she spoke of the stray dog she'd fed behind the general store. He didn't know how to raise a child, didn't know if he was doing right by her, but the sight of her small smile stirred something in him, a longing to be more than the drifter he'd been. One morning, as the frost sparkled on the grass, Jack returned from the blacksmith's to find Emma at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of milk. He'd left a pair of boots by her bedside the night before, small, sturdy, bought with his earnings, and she was wearing them, the laces tied neatly. "They fit," she said, her voice shy but pleased, and Jack nodded, his throat tight. He hadn't known how much it would mean to see her in something new, something chosen with care. "You're getting the hang of this place," he said, setting a sack of flour on the counter. "Town's starting to know you." Emma's smile faded slightly, her fingers tightening around the mug. "They talk about me," she said, "at the store. Say I'm the orphan girl, the one with no folks." Her voice was steady, but Jack saw the hurt in her eyes, the same hurt he'd felt when the world had named him a drifter, a man with no roots. "They don't know you," he said, sitting across from her. "You're Emma Tate, tougher than half this town put together." He meant it, and the way her eyes met his, searching, then softening, told him she believed him. That afternoon, Jack took her to the livery stable, where he'd been hired to repair a broken gate. Emma trailed him, her new boots kicking up dust, and watched as he hammered nails with a steady hand. "Can I try?" she asked, her voice bold despite the uncertainty in her eyes. Jack hesitated, then handed her the hammer, showing her how to grip it, how to let the weight do the work. Her first swing was clumsy, the nail bending, but she tried again, her jaw set with determination. When the nail sank true, she looked up at him, her face alight with pride. "Good," Jack said, his voice rough with something he couldn't name. "You're a quick learner." They worked side by side until the sun dipped low, the stable owner nodding his approval as he paid Jack. Emma clutched the hammer like a trophy, and as they walked back to the cabin, Jack felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. It wasn't just Emma's presence, though that was part of it. It was the way she looked at him, like he was more than a shadow passing through. That evening, as they ate a simple meal of cornbread and beans, Emma spoke up, her voice cutting through the quiet. "You ever think about staying somewhere?" she asked, her eyes fixed on her plate, not just passing through. Jack's fork paused, the question catching him off guard. He'd spent years moving, never lingering long enough to be known, to be tied down. The idea of staying, of roots, of home, felt like a weight he wasn't sure he could carry. "Never had a reason to," he said finally, his voice low. "Till now." Emma's eyes flicked up, wide and searching, and Jack felt the weight of her hope, her trust. He wanted to say more, to promise her something solid, but the words stuck. Instead, he stood, clearing the plates, and handed her a small knife to carve a stick he'd brought from the stable. She took it eagerly, her hand steady as she shaped the wood, and Jack watched, his heart stirring with a mix of fear and longing. He wasn't a father, wasn't a family man, but Emma was making him want to be. The next morning, Jack woke to find a small bundle on the table, a scarf, knitted in rough wool, left by the widow who ran the boarding house. A note pinned to it read, "For the girl." Jack set it beside Emma's boots, and when she saw it, her face lit up, her fingers tracing the stitches. "It's mine?" she asked, her voice soft with wonder. "Yours," Jack said, his voice rough. He watched as she wrapped it around her neck. The red was bright against her pale skin, and felt a pang of something he hadn't felt since his son. Pride, maybe, or love. They spent the day together, Jack teaching her to mend a harness, her small hands clumsy but determined. The work was slow, cabin quiet, but it felt right, like they were building something beyond leather and thread. Emma laughed once, a sound that caught Jack off guard, and he realized he was smiling, the lines of his face softening in a way they hadn't in years. As night fell, Jack sat by the fire, cleaning his revolver, his eyes on Emma as she sketched by the lantern's glow. The cabin was warm, the world outside held at bay, but Jack couldn't shake the unease that had followed him since the homestead. He'd seen no sign of the man from the hills, but his instincts told him danger was close. He checked the door, the windows, his hand never far from his gun. When Emma climbed into bed, her scarf still around her neck, she looked at him, her eyes serious. "You're not gonna leave, are you?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Jack met her gaze, his heart heavy with the weight of her question. "Not unless you tell me to," he said, and meant it. She nodded, pulling the quilt up, and Jack settled on the floor, his revolver beside him. The fire crackled, and the cabin held them close, but outside, the shadows moved, and the man with the rifle waited, his eyes fixed on the light in the window. The Willow Creek air grew colder as autumn tightened its grip, the mornings sharp with frost, the evenings heavy with the promise of snow. Inside the small cabin, Jack and Emma carved out a fragile routine, their days woven with small acts of care that bound them closer. Jack worked odd jobs, mending fences, shoeing horses, his earnings spent on flour, wool, and a small slate for Emma to practice her letters. Emma, in turn, filled the cabin with life, her charcoal sketches multiplying on the walls, her laughter a rare but precious sound. Yet Jack's unease lingered, a shadow that followed him as surely as his revolver, his eyes always scanning the edges of town for the threat he felt but couldn't see. Emma was growing bolder, her grief no longer a weight that bent her spine. She'd taken to helping the widow at the boarding house, carrying trays or sweeping floors, her small hands quick and sure. The townsfolk noticed her now, not as the orphan girl but as Emma, the child with the bright eyes and the drifter's shadow. Jack saw the change in her, the way she stood taller, the way her voice carried when she spoke of the stray dog she'd named Scout. But he also saw the moments when her gaze turned distant, when her hand drifted to the knife in her pocket, as if the memory of the fire still burned beneath her skin. One evening, as the sky blazed orange, Jack sat at the table, sharpening his knife, while Emma practiced her letters on the slate. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow across her auburn hair, and Jack felt a pang of something he hadn't allowed himself to name. He'd lost a family once, had sworn never to let his heart be broken again, but Emma was changing him, her presence a quiet challenge to the walls he'd built. "Why do you stay?" she asked suddenly, her pencil pausing mid-letter. Her green eyes met his, sharp and searching. "You could have left me with the Reverend or someone else. Why didn't you?" Jack's hand stilled, the knife gleaming in the firelight. He wanted to deflect, to offer a simple answer, but her gaze demanded truth. "I lost people," he said, his voice low, rough with memory. "My wife, my boy. Fever took them years ago. I walked away from everything after that. Thought it was easier to keep moving." He paused, his throat tight. "Then I found you, praying over those graves. Couldn't walk away from that." Emma's eyes softened, but she didn't look away. "You think they'd want you to stay? Your wife and boy?" The question cut deep, stirring memories of his wife's gentle smile, his son's tiny hand. "I think they'd want me to do right by someone who needs it," he said. "And you do?" She nodded, her fingers tracing the slate, and Jack saw the weight of her own losses in the set of her shoulders. "I miss Ma and Pa," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm glad you're here." The word settled over Jack like a warm blanket, and he felt the stirrings of something he hadn't dared hope for, a family, fragile but real. He reached across the table, his hand resting near hers, not touching but close enough to offer comfort. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, and the promise felt like a vow. The next morning, Jack woke to find a small gift on the table, a leather cord braided into a bracelet, left by Emma while he slept. It was simple, the knots uneven, but it was hers, made with care. He tied it around his wrist, the leather warm against his skin, and felt a surge of pride that caught him off guard. When Emma saw it, her face lit up, and for a moment, the cabin was filled with a warmth that rivaled the fire. They spent the day together, Jack teaching her to mend a bridle, her small hands fumbling but determined. He showed her how to thread the needle, how to knot the leather, his voice patient as she worked. Their fingers brushed once, and Emma didn't pull away, her trust in him a quiet gift. Jack felt the weight of it, the responsibility, and knew he'd do anything to keep her safe. That afternoon, as they walked to the general store for supplies, Jack noticed a stranger lingering near the saloon, his hat pulled low, his eyes tracking them. The man's coat was patched, his boots worn, but there was a hardness in his stance that set Jack's nerves on edge. He kept Emma close, his hand on her shoulder, and hurried her back to the cabin, his revolver a steady weight at his hip. That night, as Emma slept, Jack sat by the window, his eyes on the darkness beyond. The stranger's presence gnawed at him, a reminder of the hoof prints at the homestead, the men Emma had spoken of. He cleaned his revolver, the motions automatic, his mind racing. He didn't know who was out there, didn't know what they wanted, but he knew the look of a hunter, and he'd seen it in the stranger's eyes. When Emma woke, she found Jack still by the window, his face etched with worry. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Jack hesitated, then met her gaze. "Someone's watching," he said. "It might be nothing, might be trouble. Either way, you stay close to me, understand?" Emma nodded, her hand slipping into her pocket where her knife rested. "I can help," she said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. Jack's heart swelled, torn between pride and dread. "You're already helping," he said, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Just by being here." As the fire burned low, Jack stayed by the window, his revolver in his lap, the braided bracelet a quiet reminder of the girl who'd given him a reason to stay. Outside, the stranger moved closer, his shadow blending with the night, his intentions hidden but growing clearer with each step. The first snowflakes of winter dusted Willow Creek, settling on the cabin's roof like a soft promise of change. Inside, Jack and Emma moved through their days with a quiet rhythm, their bond deepening with each shared meal, each small act of care. The cabin, once a bare shelter, was now a home, its walls adorned with Emma's sketches, its air warmed by the fire and their growing trust. Jack's revolver remained close, his vigilance unbroken, but the sight of Emma's smile, rare but radiant, gave him a reason to hope, a reason to stay. Emma had found her place in the town, her small figure a familiar sight at the boarding house, where she helped the widow with chores, or at the schoolhouse, where she joined the other children, her slate clutched tightly. The townsfolk spoke of her with warmth now, calling her Emma Tate, not the orphan girl, and Jack felt a quiet pride in her resilience. He worked steadily, his hands calloused from labor, his earnings spent on a coat for Emma, a book of stories, small things that made her eyes light up. Yet the shadow of the stranger lingered, a threat Jack couldn't ignore, his instincts sharpened by years of dodging danger. One evening, as the snow fell thicker, Jack sat by the fire, carving a wooden horse for Emma, his knife moving with care. She sat across from him, her fingers busy with the new sketch, her face peaceful in the firelight. The bracelet she'd made him rested on his wrist, a constant reminder of the family he'd found. "You're good at that," she said, nodding at the horse, her voice soft but sure. Jack's mouth twitched into a smile. "Had practice," he said. "Made one for my boy long ago." The words slipped out, raw and unguarded, and Emma's eyes met his, holding a question she didn't ask. He wanted to tell her more, to share the weight of his past, but the moment passed, and he returned to his carving, the silence between them warm and forgiving. The next morning, Jack woke to a stillness that set his nerves on edge. The snow had stopped, leaving the world muffled, and he stepped outside, his breath clouding in the air. His eyes caught a fresh track near the cabin, a single boot print, half hidden by the snow. His hand went to his revolver, his heart pounding as he scanned the trees. The stranger was close, closer than he'd thought, and Jack knew the time for waiting was over. He returned to the cabin, his face calm to keep Emma from worrying. "Stay inside today," he said, his voice steady. "I've got business in town." She nodded, her eyes sharp but trusting, and Jack felt a pang of guilt for leaving her, even for a moment. In town, he found the stranger by the saloon, his hat low, his eyes cold as they met Jack's. The man was lean, his coat hiding a gun Jack knew was there. "You've got to take girl," the man said, his voice low, oily. "She's worth something to the right people. Hand her over, and I'll let you walk." Jack's blood ran cold, his hand steady near his revolver. "She's not for sale," he said, his voice hard. "And you're not taking her." The man smirked, his hand twitching, but Jack was faster. He drew, the revolver steady in his grip, and the stranger froze, his eyes narrowing. "You're making a mistake," the man said, but he backed away, disappearing into the alley. Jack returned to the cabin, his heart heavy with the truth. The stranger was part of the gang that had burned Emma's home, men who traded in children and lives. He couldn't let them near her, couldn't let her live in fear. That night, as Emma slept, he sat by the fire, his revolver cleaned and loaded, his mind made up. He'd face the stranger and the threat for her. The next day, Jack took Emma to the schoolhouse, his eyes scanning every corner of town. He spoke to the sheriff, a grizzled man who knew Jack's kind but trusted his resolve. "Keep an eye on her," Jack said, nodding toward the school. The sheriff nodded, his hand on his own gun, and Jack felt a flicker of relief. He found the stranger at dusk, waiting on the edge of town, his rifle glinting in the fading light. The confrontation was swift, words exchanged, then gunfire, the crack echoing across the plains. Jack's aim was true, honed by years of survival, and the stranger fell, his threat ended in the snow. Jack stood over him, his breath ragged, the weight of what he'd done settling heavy. He'd killed before, but this was different. This was for Emma, for the family he'd claimed. When he returned to the cabin, Emma was waiting, her eyes wide with fear. "I heard the shots," she said, her voice trembling. "Are you okay?" Jack knelt before her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "I'm fine," he said, "and you're safe now. I promise." He saw the truth in her eyes, the trust that had grown between them, and pulled her close, her small frame warm against his chest. In the weeks that followed, Willow Creek embraced Emma fully, the townsfolk offering her a place in their hearts. Jack stayed, his drifter's life traded for one of permanence. He built a small addition to the cabin, a room for Emma, and taught her to ride Rusty, her laughter filling the air. The bracelet on his wrist became a symbol of their bond, a family forged not by blood but by choice. As spring broke, the snow melting into streams, Jack stood on the porch, Emma beside him, her hand in his. The plain stretched before them, vast and open, but Jack no longer felt the urge to ride. He'd found his reason to stay, in the girl who'd prayed over graves and the home they'd built together. The stranger's shadow was gone, and in its place was a future Jack hadn't dared dream of, a family, small but unbreakable, rooted in love.